Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of DEI After 5. So, if you followed, if you know anything about the show, you know that I talk about all aspects of inclusion and inclusive workplaces and creating cultures of care, which means to be very intentional, which means how do you do so with thinking about things ahead of time versus being reactionary. And so our conversation today is with a guest across the pond, and I'm so excited to have this conversation. I think she's across the pond today. We'll figure that out. We'll talk about that. But Ofentse Lakwane is an accessibility expert in this space and really works with organizations in building true accessibility versus this checkbox stuff that we've been seeing lately. So Ofentse, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sacha. It's good to be here.
Wonderful. So for people who may not know who you are, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Sort of a midpoint version between long and short is Ofentse Lakwane, originally from South Africa, but I'm based in the UK. So I guess I'm across the pond regardless. And I have been working in the DEI space for almost 3 to 4 years now, but my background is in technology consulting, system development, education, and youth unemployment as well. And recently, in this 4 years that I'm talking about, we've built a technology app called Wakari, where we actually do accessibility audits of workplaces, and then obviously, and also offer training and consultancy around how to actually build meaningfully accessible workplaces. So to your point about not just tick box exercises. And it's a startup that I actually built out of a university incubator. And part of the reason for the passion for that work is because I have lived experience of a disability myself. Then having sort of moved in corporate context, it's always felt like the gymnastics and the acrobatics you have to do to be actually reasonably accommodated at work were just too many. And yet there are some things that just feel like they should be no-brainers at work. So for example, if you're a visually impaired person, why is your laptop not bigger than a standard-sized laptop, right? Because that'll probably allow you to see better if you need that Zoom function or whatever. And so sort of this lived experience and then sort of my interest in like the 1 billion disabled people on the planet, I guess, sort of led me into this. How do you marry technology with like accessibility, and how can we help HR and businesses build accessible workplaces, and thinking about this across the spectrum. So buildings, infrastructure, culture, ergonomics, processes and systems, as opposed to just this monolithic construct that we generally think about accessibility from.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. And as someone who worked in tech for 10 years, you're speaking my language.
Nice.
And I also worked for a testing company where one of my best colleagues, who we still stay in touch with now, was running the accessibility office. And so I learned so much from that experience. So you are speaking my language right now.
Require.
So I was working with, or I was contacted by a university professor, and he was saying that, one of his PhD students was looking at universal design as a way to be almost DEI 2.0, right? How do we get rid of these check boxes and really think about creating workplaces and spaces with the idea of universal design, where we're designing for everyone, or for the majority, for everyone, as many people as possible. I'll say it that way, not the majority, but for as many people as possible. Yeah. And so as you were talking, that's what was coming to mind in how do we now move into this next iteration of DEI, where accessibility is not just compliance, right? And so what does that look like in this next iteration where, and you gave a great example, but for organizations that are still kind of grappling with, in the US in particular, like ADA compliance, which is now being battled a little bit, or these things are too woke for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
What does this look like for organizations that really want to be intentional about being accessible?
Yeah. Tough question, but I'll give it a stab.
Okay.
And I think I'm gonna borrow from your language, right? Which is we actually have to think about it from a place of creating a culture of care. I think there's a lot of, we understand that we live in a capitalist world. We understand that a lot of the work that we do as businesses is for a bottom line, X, Y, Z. But the reality is that the people that actually add to that bottom line or build that bottom line out are human beings. And at the fundamental core, the ask is, how do you make human beings as comfortable as possible? Because when human beings are comfortable and cared for, they are productive, they're efficient, they're happier, they're nicer to be around, right? And so I think we just need to go back to the basics of how do we contain human care and what does that look like at work versus at home? I mean, at home, we've all got autonomy to sort of make that how we want it because we can personalize everything. But I don't think it should be that far removed at work either. So HR practitioners, well-being practitioners, managers, and people who have an interest in productivity should be saying, what's the most conducive context, one, for my employee that allows them to be as productive as possible, and even for myself, right? Because if you think about even this concept of universal design, the idea it was born from was also this idea that if you build something that's well thought out, whether it's in its design, in its functionality, in its sort of ability to traverse different contexts and environments, it helps even the people you weren't even designing it for, right? So one of the examples I like to use, particularly in the disability context, is electric toothbrushes were originally meant to only support and help people who had muscular dystrophy, for example, or had issues with like holding things or handling things for long if you've got mobility challenges. I use an electric toothbrush and I've got all the dexterities that, for all intents and purposes, are thought to be perfect or right. And yet I use one for the convenience of it. Somebody uses it as a need. I use it as a convenience. And other people even use it as a status thing, right? Electric toothbrushes just look fancier. And so with that mentality, when you're building from a culture of care, you're not even just building for the person you wanted to care for, you're building for everybody else as well. And in my mind, it should never even be about we're meeting an ADA standard in the US or we're meeting an Accessibility and Equality Act in the UK. It should be about we want the most productive employees possible. And for those people to be as productive as possible, they need to be as comfortable as possible in the workplaces that we've created. And when you then sort of overlay that with, okay, if a person has a disability, what does comfort look like? It's a very different baseline to somebody who maybe doesn't have a disability, but you still need to meet it, right? Because that's when we start talking about equity, as opposed to we don't all have to have the same chair. We just need to have the chair that fits our requirements.
Exactly.
So that's how I think about it. And I think that's how we just basically need to be human-centered about how we build our workplaces. I think we've gone too far off this idea of human centricity. And that's why laws and things like that become the must and the enforced thing. And they then become the thing that feels like it's too hard to do. Whereas this is human centricity that you're anchoring on. And so it should go without saying.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh. Everything you just said. Yes. Because I didn't even think about, the electric toothbrush, the two that immediately come to mind for me, closed captioning.
100%.
Which now almost everybody uses closed captioning.
Yeah,
and I'm like, it wasn't built for you, but
it wasn't built for most of us, but we all love it now. And it's so hard to even watch anything without it these days.
Without it.
If we've never watched something without it. And that's a perfect example.
That and the curb cuts, right? Which were made for wheelchairs. And now when you think about it, moms with strollers, delivery folks, everyone is using that curb cut. And so I love that example that you shared. People are using it, and it may be for different reasons.
For very many different reasons.
But it's something that's universally used. It's something that everyone can benefit from if needed. And so it's almost this mindset of how can we create spaces or opportunities for multi-purpose use for a thing
100%.
where people can use, it for whatever it works for them. So as you were talking, one of the things that came to mind, you mentioned chairs. And I am a person, I sit cross-legged in the chair. I have one leg up. I am just all over the place in a chair. And recently this week, I was looking for a chair that would fit how I sit and how I work.
Yeah.
And someone said, oh, look into ADHD chairs. And I'm like, that's a thing? Like, I didn't even know that was a thing. But now I'm questioning, like, do I have ADHD? Because this chair is like, perfect. But it just reminded me that there's so many things that are already out there.
Yeah.
That organizations just need to think of, how do we provide access?
Yeah.
So that people can have what they need in order to function.
Yeah.
At their highest level.
100%. And I think that's where I've seen sort of some of the magic, right, in the conversation. Because when you get into a workplace, for example, and you say, I do an accessibility assessment, people tend to do this thing where they box you into she's going to mark me passes and fails, and she's going to audit me, and it's going to be good or bad. What people take for granted is that there are some things that workplaces already have in place that are so embedded and ingrained in the workplace and so ubiquitous into the context, you don't even know that those things were there for accessibility purposes.
Right.
Half of the furniture in workplaces generally uses this felt fabric. And part of the reason for that is because that material absorbs sound a lot better than most other furniture. That's why many cubicles and open spaces and couches in those public spaces are in that felt cotton, right? Or felt material, or whatever it's called. No, typically people don't know that, but that's an accessibility feature. And so one part of the work that we do is to say, look, we're not going to come in and tell you everything is wrong. The first baseline is, let's figure out what's already right that you're doing, and let's build on top of that. Your employees are continuously changing, so some will come with new needs that you've never thought about. Could we incorporate some of that in here? And also, you're never going to get a perfectly accessible workplace, just as much as you're never going to get a perfectly DEI fully compliant workplace, whatever that means. But there's definitely worse and there's definitely better. How do we keep ourselves in a place where we're progressively getting better?
Yes.
One chair is going to fit you in your season of, I need more movement in my legs, or I need to sit cross-legged. And 10 years from there, when you're done with all your yoga and all that, and you don't want to sit cross-legged anymore, it's going to be a different chair that you're going to need. And so you're going to do this reassessment again. All that to say, this construct of like DEI has to be accepted as fluid, ever-changing, in the same way that our workforces are ever-changing and even ourselves are ever-changing. But it also doesn't have to be so far removed from like our day-to-day language and our day-to-day existence. There are things already that are accessible. There are things already that coffee machines create a culture of care, because you know what? Apparently, many people love coffee, and that's why there are standard coffee machines inside workplaces. And so the argument I always make is, what is other standard practice that we can then embed and make normal? Because there was a season where coffee machines weren't normal. Now they are, because we all love a coffee. Do you know what I mean? And so I think sometimes we tend to other this conversation way too much, and we miss the part where, don't be so worried. You're doing some things right. Just edify those things, improve on those things. And we can only get better once we get comfortable with the conversation and the language and all these things.
Hey, this conversation is getting real good. So tune in next week for part 2 as we continue the conversation.